We turn to Deuteronomy chapter 20. When we looked at the various sections of the book of Deuteronomy and we broke it down, from chapters 12 to 26, can anybody remember the breakdown of those chapters? My brother? Give me the chapter the chapter numbers. It's 12 to 26, but we broke it down. Just give me the chapters, not the...
Okay, was 27 to 32.
Chapter 12.
26, 5 to 11. Okay, you want me to break down that one?
Yeah.
Okay. It's chapter 12, 1 to 16, 17. 16, 8. 16, 18. 19, 21.
20.
21
21.
to 26. Yeah, 21 to 26, 19.
Does everybody remember that? Do we agree? And what were the titles that we gave? Sister Schneider? I can't hear you, sorry.
The first one was religion.
Okay. What does civil mean? And what does social mean? Human behaviour. So we're in chapter 20. And the title for this chapter is Laws Concerning Warfare. So we've already gone through this chapter briefly. We just want to go through it in a little bit more detail. We've spoken about armies, how an army functions, how it works. And we want to see that what's being described here is not a regular army. Verse 1. When thou goest out to battle against thine enemies, and seest horses and chariots and people more than thou, what are you inclined to feel like? What are you inclined to do? Brother?
Fear.
Fear. You're inclined to be scared because you see that they're more powerful than you are. So the instruction is, be not afraid of them. And it tells you why. For the Lord thy God is with thee, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. So who is saying that statement? Who's making that comment there? Who's speaking?
Moses.
So Moses is making a general comment about what to do when you go to Canaan and you go to war. So the fact that he's making that statement is telling you what? Sister? They don't have an organised army, but just the verse from the verse itself. What's the major issue? They fear. There are a few of them, and the people more than thou. So we can see that they're few in numbers compared to their enemies. Anyone else? Brother Rogers? They have horses and chariots, and the Israelites don't have them. So they have different weaponry, I guess we'd say more advanced. They have horses, they have chariots, and there's more of them, and this is what's going to make them afraid. So Moses is already anticipating when they go to take possession of Canaan, the overarching issue is going to be one of fear. Then he says, don't be afraid, because God will be with you, the same God that brought you up out of the land of Egypt. So what's Moses doing there?
Because to me I see that they were not also trained physically, but Moses was trying to encourage them that though they don't have awesome like those other people.
So he can see that they're not trained, but Moses is trying to encourage them.
That although they were not trained and those other people were having awesome chariots, for them the person who is behind them is God, and they have seen a lot of miracles and wonders that God has done. So the same miracles or the same wonder that God led them out of Egypt, the same God will still do the same thing, and they will defeat those people.
So the God that did miracles to bring them out of Egypt is the same God that will help them now. He spoke about not being a regular army. It says horses and chariots. Do you need to be trained to use a horse in battle and to use a chariot in battle, my sister? Yes? So the people that they're going to fight against have better weapons, they're more trained, and there's more of them. So the natural inclination is that they would be fearful. And he says, don't be afraid, because the God that led you out of Egypt will help you now. So what's he doing? What technique is he doing?
He's trying to bring their mind from physical to spiritual strength.
So he's doing that, but I want you to tell me what methodology that he's using. You ever thought? Using the technique and methodology. No?
I think he's trying to take them to past history.
So tell me the methodology.
We are the past future.
Sorry?
He's trying to take them to the past to teach them the future.
He's trying to take them to the past in order to understand the future. He's declaring the end from the beginning. With Rogers? Can someone repeat that? So he's comparing and contrasting. So he's comparing how God helped them in the past, because that's exactly the same way that God is going to help them in the future. So he's using compare and contrast. He says, go back to that history, and therefore you will know what God will do in the future history. That's exactly the methodology that we use. We call it what? Line upon line. You know what's going to happen in this history because you have evidence of what happened in the past history. We're okay with that? We saw that technique is that imagery of a lamp. Not sure why people have a problem with that. It got brought up in our class and in Elder Tessie's class. You have the past, the present, and the future. That's where they're standing. And this is compare and contrast, Alpha and Omega. What else did we say? How else can we describe it? Obviously the image that we've got here. Someone said one more thing. The end from the beginning. So we have compare and contrast. I'll say Alpha and Omega. End. The end from the beginning. And was there one more? The picture itself. You going to say something?
No, I wanted to understand how can you compare the history, teach it in the future using the past?
How can you do that? Is that what your question is? How can you...
Use the compare and contrast? Because the past, they don't know about the future. Then how can they contrast the past and the future?
Say the last bit again.
We take that example. Moses is speaking to these people of things that are going to come in the future. So how can we say he's contrasting the future with the past?
How can we say that? I'm going to suggest, Brother Benjamin, do you understand the question? Yes? He says, how can we say you can do this? So his answer is, we're not doing anything. Moses is doing that. So explain that bit.
So Moses has gone to the past history where God delivered them from Egypt. And now he encourages the people, the president tells them, when you go to Canaan, because you're going to be faced with enemies, just like we were with the enemies in the past. But God delivered us, or God gave us victory. So in the future, expect victory because it is the same God. So he's comparing, there was victory here, there has to be victory in the future.
So you agree he's referring them back to Egypt?
Then
We'll go through this step by step, then see if your question gets answered, then ask another one. Do you agree he's taking them back to Egypt?
yes,
Do you agree Egypt is in the past?
yes.
And you agree Canaan is in the future? Okay? So we'll put Egypt here. And we'll put Canaan here. You okay with that? And he's referring them back to that history. You agree with that? He's actually saying, let me tell you a little bit about that history. Because he actually speaks about it. Yes? So, we'll just read that. For the Lord thy God is with thee, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. Now, when most people will read that verse, they won't read it in the way that we've just got it here on the board, the way that Brother Benjamin has explained it. How will most people read this? what will they see? They'll just see a casual reference back to Egypt. They said, God has always led us, he'll continue to lead us. And they don't approach this in the same way that we would approach it. They won't see that what Moses is trying to do is use a very structured approach, a technique that he will compare one history with another one. They will just see this as this overarching principle or idea that God is always with us. So the way we're approaching this is in a very different way than most people would approach it. It's very rigid, very strict. We've got rules here or laws as we're going to approach that passage. And unless you're familiar with seeing it, it's not that easy to see it. Some are much clearer than this, and some are quite vague or general as this one is. So, ask your question.
Yeah, my problem is when we are using the past, then to compare is right, but now what about the contrast? How can you contrast? Because Benjamin is saying, Moses is saying that you, the same God that has done this for you, will also give you victory in your battles to come. I think that is compared. But now how can you contrast it?
Okay, so when people use that statement, compare and contrast, sometimes they use another word that's associated with it. Juxtapositioning. So juxtapositioning is when you get two independent thoughts, two independent concepts or ideas or two things, two objects, and you bring them together and they don't naturally come together. So you're forcing them. Is that a fair definition of juxtapositioning? It's two separate things which are not connected and you force them together. And when you force them together, why are you doing that? What's the purpose of forcing them together, my brother?
Compare and contrast.
To compare and contrast, my sister? Same thing? Anyone else? So, to see the similarities and to see the differences. So that is compare and contrast, but I wanted to get some simpler words. Now, if you have two things and they're far apart, it becomes very difficult to do that, to compare and contrast them or to see the similarities and differences. Do you agree with that? Yeah? So, are these two things close to each other? We'll go with this one, Egypt. Are they close to each other? No, they're not close to each other geographically. Is the dynamic the same? Is it the same dynamic? Who said yes? So Egypt is a superpower, singular country. Canaan is just a hodgepodge of separate nations, all fighting against each other, all doing their own thing. Certainly not a superpower. So I would suggest that they're not the same. They're far apart. Just that concept. They're not close. They're far apart. They're not the same. So if you were to look at this, you couldn't see intuitively or obviously that they're the same. Not only that, there's 40 years difference between this, and at a minimum, how many generations are you at? If this was the parents, what generation are you at here as a minimum? You've gone for 4 generations here in 40 years? That's difficult. Okay, so there are adults here and children. Yes? So you've got the parents and you've got the children. Those children are the ones that are here. And they've got their own children. Yeah? So by the time you get to here, not only are they geographically apart, I don't know what, 100, 200 miles, they're completely different dynamics. The whole way the country is set up looks totally different. One is a superpower, one is just lots of fighting factions, where 40 years apart, this was the parents, and these are the grandchildren now. So there's a huge difference between the two. And if you were not careful, if you could not see that the dynamic is the same, it'd be easy to miss it. So there are huge differences between the two. However, what Moses is going to do, he's going to bring these two stories, these two countries, Egypt and Canaan, together. He's going to get 40 years and squash it into two events that are side by side. Do you agree with that? Do you agree with that? Yeah? He's getting two separate things which have got nothing to do with each other, which you would say would be contrast. They're contrasting situations, not the same. And he says, take these totally different scenarios, because they look different, and do what? And bring them close together. So someone said that they're the same, and why did you say they're the same? War. So in Egypt, did they make war against the Egyptians? Who did all the work? God did all the work. Here, are they going to go to war, like proper war, with weapons? And who's going to do all the work here? Who's going to do all the work? You think God is going to? So if they sit back in their homes, cowering in fear, God's going to send angels and destroy everyone. You think? You've read the story of Joshua. That's not how it worked. Is it? What does Caleb have to do if he wants the land that he claimed? Caleb. Remember, there are two men, Caleb and Joshua. They go with the rest of the spies at Kadesh Barnea, and they spy out the land. And when they come back, they're the faithful ones. And Moses says what to Caleb? Gives him two promises. What are the two promises he receives? Put your hand up. Two promises. Sorry? Promise one, he's going to go to the promised land. Everyone else is going to die. Second promise? Anyone else? What's the second promise he receives? That's Joshua. Yeah, so I met Caleb. Caleb is going to be assured he's going to go there. And one more thing. Moses says, the land that you put your foot on when you went there as a spy, that land is the one that you will receive. I'm going to give you that land. That will be your inheritance. Agree with that? Is that what you're going to say? Yeah? So, if someone gives you inheritance, did you have to work for that? No? Just a gift, isn't it? They give it to you on a plate. What's the reality when they go to Canaan? What does Caleb have to do when he wants that hill He has to fight for it. And if he doesn't fight hard, will he get what he wants? No. Agree with that? So the reason why Moses is reminding them about God is not because God is going to do the work, it's because God is, my sister, God is, the reason why Moses is going to remind the people not to be scared when he compares it to here is not because God is going to do all the work for them, it's because God's going to, he's not going to do any of the work. So there's clear differences. God did all the work, he does none of the work here. They have to go and do all the work, they have to fight. So this was all supernatural, and this is all natural. What is natural and supernatural? That parable teaching, backwards. It's the spiritual, and that's the natural. So it's all mixed up. All the methodology that we use, it's all here, compare and contrast. So there's a lot to contrast. There's big differences between the two. It's so contrasting. If you looked at it, what would you think? Contrasting. What does contrast mean? The way you explained it. Different. It's so contrasting, there is no similarity. You agree with that? So if there's no similarity, what would you be here? Your emotion. What would your emotion be? Tells you in the verse. What emotion you're going to have? Fear. You say, if it was like Egypt, what would it be like? It'd be good. No fear. Because you can just sit down, lay back, and God does all the work for you. You don't have to do anything. So, you're fearful now because God helped the grandparents. In this story, it's the parents that are the children that will fight. So God helped the parents, but God's not going to help us. We have to do all the work. It's not fair. So a clear contrast. And then he says what? What does Moses say? Brother Robert, what does he say? Moses, what does he say? He says, stop contrasting and start comparing. Don't look at the differences, look at the similarities. Okay with that? And what is the similarity? The overarching principle. God saved them here, and God will save us here. It's exactly the same story. But it looks so different, unless someone told you, you wouldn't believe it looks the same. You wouldn't believe it's the same history. Yeah? So Ellen White, when she comments on Daniel 11, she doesn't word it like we do. We say the Millerite history is a template. What does a template mean? A template. When you got a template, what's the template used for? A point of reference, but it has certain characteristics. So it's a point of reference that has a characteristic of being
I'm saying a template provides a certain pattern.
a pattern. So it's a reference point, a pattern, and I'm going to say it's identical. You take a template and you check or measure things against it. So if it was slightly different, would it be a template? So if you were doing accurate engineering and the template was 100 centimeters and you put that against your object and it was 102 centimeters, has it passed or failed? Failed. So I'm going to say here, this is what? the template. And this is the object. Are they the same? They look the same. It's not a circle. What's the problem? You said no, Sister Snyder. What's the problem? It's only a little bit. What does Ellen White say about that famous passage from Daniel 11? Scenes. These look similar. They're not the same, are they? They're not the same, but they're similar. So, if you went in this movement and it said similar, in fact, if you're not in this movement and Ellen White says similar, what could you say about her comments compared to what we say? If you're not in the movement, if you just read her statement, looks the same, but it's not the same. It's not the same. And our emphasis is what? When we say template, what point do we want to make? We never say similarities. What do we say? We say it's identical. That's the whole point, isn't it? We could say, oh, Christ's first advent is similar to his second advent. Everybody would be okay with that. Even a nominal evangelical Christian would say, sure, that's okay. First advent, second advent. What do we say when you go into the Gospels? We did in our studies earlier, near the beginning of school. What is the purpose of the Gospels? To teach us what? Which history? Specifically. No? History of? It specifically teaches you the history of the priests. It's our history. Then the first part of the book of Acts is Levites. Then you go to the Nethinims. So it's specifically teaching you the history of the priest. We would say now, once you become familiar with that and you observe it, that's its purpose. Can anybody see that if you read those 4 Gospels? No. You could see things that are similar, but we say they're identical. Depending on how good we are, depending on how knowledgeable we are, how much experience we have, we can go into those stories and we can find exact patterns. We can find exact stories which are being perfectly fulfilled today, exactly fulfilled. Yes? John chapter 6. What's the issue in John chapter 6? The issue. That's the story. What's the issue? Natural or spiritual? Is this literal flesh or spiritual flesh? And those people in the room are all failing that test, aren't they? What do they want? They want manna. And Jesus says, why do you want manna when I was there? Don't you know that your parents ate me in the wilderness? Yes? Isn't that what he says? He says, I was the true bread that came down then, and I'm also the true bread that comes down now. So, the problem that we're confronted with is the way Ellen White approaches this. It's very soft, seen similar to this. Of course it's going to be similar. What was that history? The rise of the papacy. We're going to have the rise of the papacy now. It'll be similar. Similar is not enough, is it? We want to be exact. We want to have time of the end. We want dates. We want timing. We want years. We want spans of history. We become very precise. So she will talk about things that are similar. We talk about things that are exactly the same. So when you approach this, Similar doesn't help you. What we want to see is when you look at it, it looks very different, but it's similar. You go from one nation, you go to another nation, one country to another country. It has similarities, but we're not interested in them. We're interested in the precise comparisons between the two. So are we okay with that? Has my battery run out or back to normal? You okay with that, my brother? That you are contrasting the completely different scenarios. Sometimes when we use contrast, we force two things together to show us differences. And sometimes you do it to show us the similarities. In this story, two contrasting issues are being brought together to compare them, which means to see that they're the same. So, when we say compare and contrast, it's just a phrase now. So if we wanted to do it properly, we'd say, in this story, what are we doing? Are we contrasting the stories or are we comparing them? We're comparing them. So we're comparing them by recognizing that the contrasting differences we ignore. Daniel 2, you have a mountain and you have a statue. What are we doing there? What do we want to see? We want to observe the contrast or the differences between them. But in order to observe the differences, what do we have to recognize? What do you have to recognize? The similarities. If you don't recognize the similarities, you can't even check the contrast. So what's the contrast of these two? Contrast we'll go with opposite. Contrast, difference. What's this one compared to this one? That's the symbology. That's the symbology. This is bad, and this is good. In order for that to actually mean anything, what do you have to say? You have to compare them and see something that they're the same. What are they the same? In what context are they the same? Bad? What? Good? Kingdom. These are the same. If you want to use compare and contrast in that way, these are the same, these are completely different. But in order to actually see the difference and to actually make any sense of it, you have to see that they're the same thing. Does that make sense? If you don't use that, what ends up happening? What trap do you fall in if you don't see that? What is this a story of? If you don't see what we just discussed. So now we're seeing the problems that you'll get into. What is this the story of? Sorry? Kingdoms, bit more. Kingdoms. Where? And this? Sorry? Where is it? There's no Adventist that believes it's on earth, except you folks. Where is it? It's in heaven, because you're not comparing and contrasting. If you don't see the similarities and lock them in, you lose the ability to say this is earth and earth. Because I said kingdom, but actually it's a kingdom on earth and a kingdom on earth. Good one and a bad one. If you don't use these rules and allow them to guide you, you end up making mistakes. It gets crazy because this becomes a story of what? the second advent, and it's the destruction of the earthly empires. And you know by now, this story has got nothing to do with the second advent. It's not the second advent story. It's a completely different scenario. And you make the mistake because of this. Is that okay? So that's why it becomes important when we talk about these rules that we become quite rigid about them. Otherwise, we can't learn any lessons. So verse 1, he recognizes that there's a completely different scenario. And now, God can't be seen. God is not there. He's not going to be before you in the pillar of cloud, in the pillar of fire, is he? That's all gone. The visible presence has gone. No Shekinah glory, nothing. Now it's just blood, sweat and tears. And they are not trained. The enemy has got superior weapons, chariots, horsemen, they're trained. And who wouldn't be afraid in that situation? All of us would be. So he says, don't worry, because this is the same story that we have here. Yep. And remember, what did Moses want to do? What did Moses want to do? He wanted to? No, he didn't. What did Moses want to do? When he's 39. He wants to go to Egypt and do what? Raise up an army. God isn't there. And do what? And fight. The same thing that they have to do here. So Moses is even talking about his own foolish experience. Yes? So Moses wanted to fight a proper literal fight with an army, and God said, no, it's not how it works. How could you be so silly? And now God says, here, what do you have to do? You have to do the silly thing now, don't you? The very silly thing that Moses wanted to do, now they have to do it here. And now the children are saying, we don't want to do it that silly way. It's silly to go and fight. Why can't God just go and wipe them away with plagues? Can we see that? Everything that Moses wanted to do, God said that was a silly idea. Now he tells you to do it. He tells you to do the silly thing. And everyone says, we like the sensible thing, the Egypt sensible one. And God says, no, that's silly to do it that way. Everything gets flipped, gets changed. Yep. By the way, when we go through all of these things, what's the purpose of it? What's the purpose of all of that? Seeing what happened in the past, they wanted it one way, God did it another way, and now we want it. And he said, your way is silly. And now he says, actually, your silly ways before are my ways now, it's all good. And the way you want it today is a silly way, which is the way I wanted it before. What's the purpose of learning all those things? Those twists and turns, besides having Godal and showing people how clever we are, being able to manipulate the word and drawing out all these truths. What's the purpose of all of this? Brother Dennis, what's the purpose of it all? A lesson to teach us. So the last point he made was that in the past it was clear that God was with the Millerites, and now it all seems we're doing it all by ourselves in our own strength. Very little safety. But he said a lot more than that. Sorry? God gives instructions with respect to different dispensations. Sister Joy, any thoughts? Okay, verse 1. Done, hopefully. We compared and contrast two verses. Sister Joy, which two verses did we compare and contrast when we looked at this a couple of days ago? Chapter 20. Deuteronomy chapter 20. Just did verse 1. We compared two verses. We did it really quickly, so we may not remember. You can't see it? Okay, so let's walk through it then. You and I. So, verse 1, Moses is speaking. Yes? And he explains everything that we're spoken at. You're okay with all of that? Okay, so now we're in verse 2. So, did you have a read of verse 2? Have a read of verse 2. And what's going on in verse 2? So, have you read verse 2? So my question is, what's going on in verse 2? And I'll give a context compared to verse 1. So you said the priest has a role to play. And what's his role? What's he doing? What's he saying? What's his role? So she said it's exactly the same thing that Moses did. So we can compare verse 1 and verse 2. Moses and the priest. So the priest is going to remind the people what Moses said, in case they forget, which they likely will. So we're in verse 2, and the priest is going to do exactly what Moses said. We'll read verse 2. And it shall be, when ye are come nigh unto the battle, that the priest shall approach and speak unto the people. So it's not just verse 2, obviously. She read down a bit further. Verse 3. And shall say unto them, Hear, O Israel, ye approach this day unto battle against your enemies. Let not your hearts faint. Fear not, do not tremble, neither be ye terrified because of them. For the Lord your God is he that goeth with you to fight for you against your enemies to save you. So it's a slightly extended version of what Moses had said in verse 1. So it's a repeat and enlarge of verse 1. So the priest stands in the place of Moses. We all okay with that? Yeah? We didn't discuss that last time. We went to verse 2 and we said, the priest shall approach and speak. And we contrasted or compared that with something else, Sister Joy. We just read verses 3 and 4. The priests have spoken, And now what happens after the priests have spoken? We've done verses 1, 2, 3 and 4. Which verse are we in? We've done verse 1 to 4. Which verse are we in now? Shout out the number. No, we've done verses 1 to 4. So the verse that comes after is verse 5. And what does it say at the beginning of the verse? Don't. Officers do what? Officers speak in verse 5 and verse 2. What happens? The priests speak. So we compared and contrast the priests and the officers. Remember that? Okay? Everyone okay? We didn't go into the details of what's going on there, but we had the priests and the officers. They've obviously got different job functions, otherwise they'd be the same thing. Yes? So, the officers are some kind of military personnel, and the priests are obviously some kind of religion. If you want to go for church and state, maybe that's what it's leading to. Maybe not, I don't know. But I want us to see that the priests repeat what Moses said, and then after all that's done, then the officers speak. Are we okay with that? Let's just go back to the priest. What are the priests basically saying? If you're afraid, don't be, because who's going to fight? God's going to fight. Verse 4, for the Lord your God, he is he that goeth with you to fight for you against your enemies to save you. So who's doing all the fighting now? God's doing all the fighting. Problem is you can't see him. Yeah? Everyone okay with that? Verse 3. What does verse 3 say? You shall say unto them, the priests. Sorry, this is Moses talking to the priests. Is that right? And shall say unto them, this is what Moses says, he says, this is what the priest will say. Hear, O Israel, the priest is talking, ye approach this day unto battle against your enemies. And then what does he say? 4 times, what does he say? Don't be scared, he says it 4 times. Why would he do that? Why would he say it 4 times, the same thing? Did you say something? It's a major problem for them. We can just go with that. It's a major issue. If we didn't want to take the symbology of number 4, if we just, so it's really an all-encompassing. Number 4 has many properties. Progressive destruction. What else? 4 means progressive restoration. Are you sure? Okay. One more. Worldwide. I want to go for worldwide. Complete. So he's going to mention their fear 4 times. This is complete and utter fear. This is not just, oh, I'm a little bit scared. This is utter fear that these people are experiencing. Inside, they're melting. Outside, what are they doing? Their loins are shaking. And if we could be gross about it, what's going on in their underpants? Yeah? They're just wetting themselves in fear. Yeah? That's what men do. or say men because there's soldiers or whatever. Women do the same. They just stand there and they wet themselves. Yeah? By the way, we think that's funny. Is that the... Have you ever trapped a mouse? Cornered it. What will it do? It just wheezes itself, doesn't it? Wheezes and poops itself. So it's not just a human phenomena. So this is complete and utter fear. Internally, externally, they're shaking, they're wetting themselves, their hearts are crumbling. I want to read this from another version. It says, and say, soldiers of Israel, listen to me. Verse 3. Today, when you go into battle, don't be afraid of your enemy, and when you see them, don't panic. So, it's the sentiments there, but it doesn't give the depth of the meaning, does it? Go there and just say, don't panic. They're already panicking, and they haven't even gone to war. I like the way the King James says it. Let not your hearts faint. Fear not. Do not tremble. Neither be ye terrified. We could go into each one of those words and see the nuances. We won't do that. It's a worthy study to see what fear looks like. So, if we just did what we normally do, they're going into Canaan, we're going into heaven. Can we do that, by the way? Can we go to earthly Canaan, heavenly Canaan? Can we do that? Do we normally do that? We say they're going to the heavenly Canaan, and we're going to they're going to the earthly Canaan, we're going to the heavenly Canaan. We normally do that, yeah? Can we do that in this situation? So when we go to heavenly Canaan, there's going to be loads of enemies there that we have to fight. Is that correct? There's no enemies in heavenly Canaan. No? Canaan begins before we get there. Is it? Don't we sing all these hymns where it says, we'll gather by the river, on the other side of the river? That's not just one hymn. There's loads of hymns that talk about that. If you're familiar with Pilgrim's Progress, to get from this side to that side, what do you have to do? You have to cross a river. What river is that you have to cross? It's the Jordan, isn't it? Yeah. Everyone knows. This is not an Adventist theology. Everyone knows when you cross the river, you're on the other side. Everything's good there, isn't it? He says when you cross the river, what's going to happen? You have to fight. There's going to be fear. Utter, total fear. So when we do this story, in this context, we can't say, this is heavenly Canaan, can we? We don't do that. In fact, what do we say Jericho is? Often, simple. Jericho equals Sunday law. There might be some nuance there. There might be some details that it's a bit more than that or a bit less. Midnight cry. We might do all of that fancy stuff. But simply it's Sunday law. So when you're crossing the Jordan and you're going into Canaan, that's not heaven, is it? What's that? That's a battle. That's Sunday law, isn't it? This is the Sunday law issue when you're going to go fight with the nations. So, what are we saying? When we're going to fight with the nations, what experience will we have? Utter, complete fear. Why? Who's not with us? God isn't with us. God is not with us. We need a priest to remind us not to be afraid. Yeah? Obviously we're all priests. Must be speaking about us. So someone's going to stand up amongst us and say to all of you people, when you're going to battle, stop being afraid because you're utterly scared. Yes? Any comments on that? Can't compare this to heavenly Canaan. Heavenly Canaan is holiday time. This is wartime. Yes? Crossing the Jordan is before Sunday law. Everybody okay with that? It might sort of catch you by surprise, but it's not. People have already done presentations on this. Elder Tess has already approached this subject from this perspective. Yes? So shouldn't really be a surprise. But sometimes we get caught off guard because our natural instinct is say, earthly Canaan, heavenly Canaan. It's not that, because we don't fight then. When we go into the Sunday law battle, you have to do it all by yourself.
I was trying to think one of the presentations that has done. I think she never put Jericho in Sunday. She put it from Paniam or within our ministry. So I was trying to think that it's not even far. Entering Canaan, it's some months.
And we have multiple Sunday laws, all going through our history. We've obviously done one, 14 to 19. So all of that was done in whose strength? Whose strength? God's strength, was it? No, God's strength was over here. You see God here. What do you see here? You see human beings. If Caleb doesn't fight well, he doesn't get his property. Yeah? Now you can argue, well, he can beat 10 men up, he can win the battle because God's entered into him and he's helping him with his sword arm, but you can't see any of that. All you just say is, Caleb is so old and he's a good fighter. That's all you can see, isn't it?
Maybe I want to put this, that God helped them in crossing the Red Sea, but now to cross Jordan to the other side, it was also their strength. You have to put your leg on water for you to cross. So those are, it was also rhyming with what God did in Egypt and with what they are supposed to go and fight. The first fight was done by God, the first crossing of the river was done by God, but now the second crossing of the river need your effort and the fight also.
Brother Rogers. Sunday law, 2014 to 15. What's it going to look like? Sorry, 14 to 19. What should we have expected it to look like based upon what we're talking about? We're going to fight. We have to fight. What else? Have a think, my brother. You had your hand up. You had your hand up?
What I was thinking is, by Moses referring them history back, we have been with someone who referring you back once you have faith. Faith is a knowing of the past. So I think the Israelites had lost that faith, and by Moses trying to take them back to the past, trying to bring their faith back.
Who would this be? This would be the Millerites, our fathers. This would be us. We're all okay that the Millerites were led by God. God controlled the mind of these people. When we look at ourselves, do we have any consciousness of that? Back in this history? None. It's all done by human endeavour, human effort. We stumble and fall. People die. It all looks so humanistic. Human endeavour. But God is with us. Okay, let's move on. Verse 5. And the officers shall speak unto the people, saying. Now this officer is going to do a lot of speaking. And where does he finish his speaking? Everyone okay with that? Verse 9. He begins speaking in verse 5 and he ends speaking in verse 9. Verse 9. And it shall be when the officers have made an end of speaking. No more speaking now. They've finished their speaking. Then what do? They say, now go and fight. Who does the fighting? Sister Elizabeth, who does the fighting? The captains. What do the officers do? So do the officers fight? Okay, can we see that? Officers are not fighting. Captains are fighting. Everyone agree with that? We might call them a general. Might call them a leader. But they're not the ones that are fighting. Everyone okay with that? So the officers will give some instruction. Once they're given the instruction, then they say, now go and fight. And we'll just sit back and watch you do it. Now they're going to give some instruction. We'll go back to verse 5. The officers shall speak. Verse 8. The officers shall speak more. So the officers speak, they speak more, they end their speech. We're okay with that? Verse 5, verse 8, verse 9. So they do how many speeches? Sister Dorcas, how many speeches do the officers do? Tell me if you need some help. Need some help? Okay? My question is, how many times do the officers speak? How many speeches do they do? When's the first time they speak? Which verse? Don't help her. Sorry? Verse 3? The verse 3, they're not speaking in verse 3. Verse 5. So in verse 5, the officers will speak. That's the first time. Then they do a little speech. Then the next time they speak is where? Verse 8. Verse 8, it says, the officers shall speak further, which means they speak a second time. So they've spoken 2 times, and in verse 9 says, they finished. So how many times do the officers speak? 2 times. Everybody can see that? The officers speak 2 times. They've got 2 speeches. So, without even looking at the verses, 2 speeches means 2 what? 2 messages. 2 subjects. I was going to say 2 subjects as well, but 2 messages in the context that we have it is good. So, 2 speeches, 2 subjects, 2 messages. We're going to talk about 2 separate subjects. We okay with that? So all we need to do now is find out what the 2 subjects are. We okay? Are we following how we break down the chapter? Is it being relatively straightforward so far? When you just read it, do you see any of this? No, you see nothing when you just read. When you pause and you start thinking, and most importantly, for me, maybe not for you, when you come in a group with people of like mind, you can begin to see what's going on. When people add their thoughts and ideas, when we work together as a team, when we're in harmony, we can see how the scriptures open up. We're only on verse 4 at the moment. Are we all in harmony with everything that we've taught? One moment. Yes? Anybody disagree with what we've all said together? So I think it's, unless my brother's going to disagree, it's a miracle you can get 60, 70 people all agreeing. And if we had done this before and I said, write a paragraph on what Deuteronomy chapter 20 is, we'd have about 20, 30, maybe 50 different stories of what this paragraph or this chapter is meaning. But when we study it together, we can all come to the same conclusion. Hopefully, we can continue to do that through our study, and when we get into chapter 22, verse 5. But at the moment, I don't want to repeat what we've said, but we're all okay. Make a comment? Okay, so we're going to go into in our next class what the subjects are. But all I wanted to say at the moment is that we can clearly show, even without looking at the verses, because you've looked at the verses. I didn't even want to look at the verses. All I want us to see is if it says the officer speaks, verse 8, further means he speaks again. Verse 9, end of speech, he spoke twice. If he has two speeches, it must mean two subjects, two messages. I want us to see that. And as you say, when you go into that, the reason why I want to make that point is from verse 5, 6 and 7, there's multiple things that he's speaking about. It's not one issue. But if he's going to say he spoke then and he spoke further, how should we understand that? The first speech is a singular subject. But what happens is when you read the verses, it doesn't what? It's different things. They're not the same things. They might even be not related. It's all about how we approach. It's the methodology that brings us into harmony. All we can do in a class like this is have an intellectual assent to the truth. All of us are frightened to our very core about what's going to happen when we go to battle. Even though you may not believe it, that's what's being prophesied. That's why we want to read this, to see exactly how to understand the experience that we're going through. All we can do in our class is do an intellectual assent to that. So, two speeches, it ends in verse 9. In the next class, we'll see what the speeches are. Lord willing, we're coming to unity and trying to understand the two subjects that need to be dealt with when it comes to warfare. Let's pray. Remember, the subject of all of this is Deuteronomy 22, verse 5. Our Heavenly Father, we want to thank you for your goodness and mercy as we dwell upon your word. Help each of us, Lord, to enter into these truths, not only intellectually, but through an experience that we have. Help us to recognize your leading. Lord, help us to see how easy it is to miss so much light, so many truths, so much treasure. We ask, Lord, that we would put aside our differences, our own preconceived ideas, our guessing, our gadal, our creed, and come together as brothers and sisters to open up the truth. This is not the work of one person. We cannot do it by ourselves. Lord, we've seen in this class this morning, as we approach this chapter by working together, so much light can be derived. Please be with us and guide us and help us, Lord, to have the spirit of entering into harmony, not guessing, not having our own ideas, and not having pride to try to be someone. Let this be our experience, not only for the rest of the day, but for the remaining time at our school. We pray in Jesus' name.